Hello, welcome to Critical Myth Theory. My name's Joel.
My name's Alex. Let's get into it.
Alright, so today we're going to be talking about JRR Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings in particular, but a little bit of The Hobbit as well.
Yeah, I can't really get into it too much without referencing The Hobbit at least once.
No, absolutely. And we'll be talking about this in 3 points, as usual. The inspiration for why Tolkien wrote what he wrote, his impact today, and the themes in these stories, which there are a fair few of them, and I suspect on this third point we're going to have all kinds of sub-points and so much stuff to talk about.
Yeah,
I'm
for
excited.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. We're not going to spend too much time on the first 2 points. A lot of this stuff is pretty general knowledge. Some of you may even come across this stuff as you've heard before. So, again, the themes are going to be really the meat of what we're going to be getting into today. But yeah, like I said, we can kind of get into the first 2 points. So yeah, let's kind of talk about for why Tolkien kind of wrote what he wrote. So, do you know a bit of the background as to some of the inspirations, at least, of what Tolkien had?
I gotta be quite honest, I don't, but based on what you told me, it was a lot of Norse mythology and Greek mythology that you were talking about. I think those were the two.
Kinda, yeah. So, I mean, a lot of Norse mythology. The Inklings were very much influenced by older stories, in particular. So, the Inklings is kind of a group of writers that Tolkien was a part of, one of the founding members of. In his youth, he had come across these other like-minded individuals who wrote, and they were very critical of each other's writings. The other one that is more famous, or sorry, almost just as famously known, but more so than the others, would be C.S. Lewis, as part of the Inklings. So they would often get into writing, and they would write their own stuff and critique it very often. A lot of what Tolkien did as a starting point was he was a philologist, so he dealt with a lot of languages, right? And so he was very, very interested in making his own, and that's when he came across Elvish. And I think the reason that he started kind of writing the story itself was because he realized, I have this language. It needs to have more to it. It needs to be reasons. Where does this language come from? What is it? Who spoke it? And suddenly he started creating a new world, which he eventually coined as Middle-earth, and is now the world that we know today. In Tolkien's writings. So that's kind of a bit of that background. But it's interesting because, we see Norse mythology as a big influence on him, because before Tolkien, and this is kind of get into the second point a little bit, but so I'm not going to get too far ahead of myself here. But before Tolkien, any reference to elves or the dwarves, or as they were called at that point in time, were actually elves and dwarfs, was typically...
Sorry, come again? Elves and dwarves?
Dwarfs. So
dwarfs.
Yeah, so
the
way that they were
dwarves.
so the way that they were spelt before Tolkien came along would have been pluralized, would have just been add an S at the end of the word dwarf or elf. And then Tolkien came along and kind of changed that and said, no, I like it how it translates better as VE for both of them. So
Anglicize it a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I guess as a philologist, he decided to take that on himself, and as authority, he could do that apparently, and so that's how we got it today. But yeah, like any sort of reference to elves previously would have been, Celtic folklore or Norse folklore, Norse mythology. Right, you get the dark elves in Norse mythology, and you get now typically they were very different than what Tolkien wrote about, but you can see the influence of the dwarves and the elves in the original of the Norse mythology writings. Actually, in fact, so the whole character storyline of, for example, The Hobbit, right, where we have Smaug kind of coming in and taking over the mountain, the king of the mountain who became too greedy, is actually a theme he pulled out of from one of the Norse mythologies of Fafnir. Fafnir was basically this dwarf who became so corrupted by this gift that he had from Loki, and eventually it turned him into a dragon. And he was a dwarf, right? It was kind of this interesting... once you kind of read the story of Fafnir, you're like, this is very familiar to what Tolkien wrote in The Hobbit. In that sense, like, you can definitely see the influence there. But anyways, to kind of go beyond that, some of his themes were kind of... we see the theme of punishing greed, but at the same time, one of the bigger influences on Tolkien as well was his faith. He was a devout Catholic who we then see a lot of Christian sub-themes in his writings as well. And yeah, you can, even in his world building, if you were to read the Silmarillion, sorry, slip of the tongue, he gets into the world building behind the scenes, and he kind of creates his own theology of it almost, and it's very reminiscent of a creation story, which is all very, very interesting. But then I guess the final big influence on what he wrote, I would say, is going to be the war itself. Tolkien was a fighter in the First World War, and he takes a lot of that and writes a lot of it. We especially see that in, for example, how the hobbits react to coming home from the war, right? He can kind of, I think you can kind of see that as how the hobbits react outside the war, how they hear about these dark things and they kind of put it off, as though those who were at home hearing about the war and then actually getting into it and then coming home and not being able to adjust, right? You have kind of the three different characters of Merry, Pippin, and Sam, how they all try to adjust their own way, and Frodo himself is even a bit different too, where he can't really adjust, he can't settle down. He kind of has his PTSD moments, right? Whereas Sam, he finds his own way to settle down, and Merry and Pippin kind of find their own way to... They come back changed, but not necessarily for the worse, but for the better, right? And so that, yeah, we can definitely see some of the themes there. And again, we weren't going to spend too much time on this point, so...
So I guess we can move on to our second point, do you think?
Yeah, for sure.
The impact today. Thanks for totally taking the first point, because I know none of that stuff. I learned a fair bit there. Also, it goes without saying that if you're listening to this, big spoiler alert, but I think that it goes without saying we're going to be getting into a lot of the conclusions, because that's where you can find the meaning in a lot of these stories. Yeah. So everything's going to be spoiled. If you haven't watched them, you're going to be so either lost or upset that we spoiled everything.
Yeah, it's been like, what, 90 years since the books came out, and it's been 20 years since the movies came out. So I mean,
how dare you if you haven't either read or watched them?
Yeah. Now, that being said, any of the stuff that I said that was a bit more biographical or whatever else in the historical end of it, if you kind of come across information that's a bit different than mine or conflicting with mine, feel free to share it with us. I mean, I'm no source of Tolkien expert thing. This is more what I've kind of gathered over the years. So if you've come across different information, yeah, feel free to share it.
And with that, I think we can move on to the second point, which is his impact today, and how he's influenced modern fantasy and, well, therefore contemporary mythology. Now, with his impact today and his impact after these books coming out, it's really hard to measure because there's just so much of it and a broad range of it.
Yeah.
I mean, this almost revitalizing of old fantasy characters into the modern psyche. That's one really big thing.
Yeah. Especially into the minds of the adults, right? Because
yeah.
back then it would have been considered childish to consider these things.
That's right, fairy tales.
Right. Yeah.
No, that's definitely the case. I didn't think of that. So beyond the just the fairy tale for the children, it's also now got a deeper mythological sense to it. It's got a world to it now. It's not just once upon a time, a long time ago in this world, and that's what that indicates. This is no. Here's an entirely new world with new structures, with new peoples. Not this world, a different world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I kind of was marveling at that, and I was really scratching my brain to try to figure out if there was anything before Tolkien that actually did something that was extra-worldly. Like, not extra-worldly, otherworldly. Right? Like, there are writings either around that time or before that time, of course, that were beyond our world, right? Even Norse mythology, we see, the other realms beyond Midgard. Same thing with, Greeks, you have Olympus, you have Nyx, you have these different areas of existence beyond our world. And yeah, but at the same time, Middle-earth doesn't exist in our world at all, and there is no access to our world. So in that sense, it's very different than even these other places. And I'm curious as to see if there was any, if anyone else knows of any previous stories that had that existence that didn't connect to our world in any way. I'd love to hear about it, because that was something I was really trying to trying to find and couldn't come across. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've kind of looked for those types of stories, within my own time. I like to read that sort of stuff, but I haven't really come across it either. So if Tolkien didn't start it, he definitely popularized it.
Yeah.
And I think it's pretty safe to say that. And I guess we can also just talk about the movies themselves. The Lord of the Rings movies by Peter Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
How they became such a phenomenon and even increased the popularity of the Lord of the Rings.
It was kind of like this perfect storm even, right? Because we're talking like 20 years ago, which movies from 20 years ago don't really hold up to the same quality as movies of today, with the exception of, I would say, Lord of the Rings. Right? Not to say that those movies aren't as good, but to say that the quality of even just the writing, video editing, and whatever else, it's just such a phenomenal work of art that has not been, in my opinion, surpassed. And yeah, it's just such a, again, it was a kind of the perfect storm, and in a similar sense, it's actually a very influential. I was actually kind of just commenting this to Joel as we were watching the Two Towers yesterday. We were looking at Gollum and seeing his seeing how well he was made, and the motion capture technology that was put behind him was actually one of the things that kind of gave James Cameron the green light to go ahead and make something like Avatar, because he didn't. Yeah, their technology for that stuff didn't exist before Gollum, didn't exist before Lord of the Rings. That kind of motion capture of an individual who was able to be represented on the real screen, like that. So it was, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh well, when you go with Avatar, it's just another fantasy, but with more sci-fi in it. But it's another fantasy block. Also, as you can see, directly inspired by Tolkien's work here. After Peter Jackson.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, like, I can go on about the movies forever, but that's why they have commentaries and stuff like that. So we probably shouldn't go too much, but it does have a huge impact today, right? Because we see certain projects, I think, trying to live up to Lord of the Rings movies, right? We see every kind of popular fantasy story now needs to be told on the big screen. Since then, Harry Potter, I'd say, is probably one of the more successful ones. And then something like Game of Thrones had been successful until, of course, its very end. That didn't necessarily stay true to the original writing, though. But then you have something like Aragon, which was a horrible representation of the content. And something like that just didn't live up. And there's very few fantasy movies we can point to and say, no, that lives up. And none of them have surpassed Lord of the Rings in that sense, especially in the fantasy genre in particular.
I would also say that Lord of the Rings was created in the perfect time. They just had the technology to create this very picturesque and artistic and archaic world in a modern lens look to it. But also, it was created in a time where you could spend a bit more time working on scenes.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't need to be within this certain time limit because the overall attention span was longer, and people were willing to pay a longer attention to details.
Yeah.
If you look to movies 30, 40 years from now, they go at greater pains to paint a story, and they might make you feel a little bit awkward while you're watching it, but they do sit with you more than I would say the movies do today, because the movies today are very much that present entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Lord of the Rings really nicely straddles that.
Yeah, for sure. But again, we shouldn't get into necessarily too much of the movies. It's not a podcast about the movies. It's just more about the general content. So yeah, I mean, just to kind of see the influence of modern fantasy. I mean, modern fantasy is kind of, I'd say, owes its description of the genre itself right now to Tolkien. Sure, there are others that kind of weigh in on that influence, but I think he's the kind of the father of modern fantasy. Without him, we would not have modern fantasy as it is. Right? And we see that in simple tropes, things like elves and dwarves is obviously a very the dwarves and elves that we know as in modern fantasy are from the pages of Tolkien, not from Norse mythology, the original content. Same thing with like this, the whole hero's journey that Tolkien kind of brought into this fantasy thing is now so closely tied to the idea of fantasy, whether it be like the chosen one who's pulled from the farm boy-esque kind of I mean, Frodo wasn't a farm boy, but that's kind of that trope all comes from something like Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is not to go. Yeah, I mean, we can kind of spend forever on how his impact is done today, but I think we should probably get on to the third point, which is going to be on the themes that we see in the stories.
Mm-hmm. And the themes, well, there's plenty of themes. There's all kinds of themes.
Yeah.
Themes of the effects of temptation, the corruption of good things by evil, greed, watching the underdog, I guess rise above the traditionally powerful, but almost in a meek way, mm-hmm. not in a desire to gain power, but in a desire to do good.
Right.
And then mercy is a big one when talking about Gollum. Companionship, I think, is a massive element that's in really anywhere that you find it in the books or in the movies. It's really well shown. If you talk about the Fellowship of the Ring, not the book, although in the book, but the actual Fellowship, also the Shire, very connected people. Mm-hmm. The elves and the people of Gondor and Rohan, they all have this really connected community element to it, and they're very much each other's people.
Yeah.
And finally, the self-destruction of evil.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think we can. Well, how do we want to start this off with?
I guess I wanted to kind of give a bit of an explanation, because some of the things that you hear in contemporary discussions of Tolkien, people will often say that, Tolkien hated allegory. That's often quoted. And it's a bit of a misunderstanding, because what we understand as allegory is not necessarily the same thing that Tolkien understood as allegory, what he hated. Right? What we see in, for example, Narnia is a bit more clearly metaphorically, Aslan was Jesus Christ, kind of metaphorically in the realm of Narnia. And so when Tolkien says that he hates allegory, it's not that he hates representation of Christian themes or Christ-like characters in his work. That's not at all what he is referring to. What he is referring to in that sense is just this discussion of allegory would be something like a work of allegory that they would point to as allegory would be the Pilgrim's Progress, where every single thing in that story points to something in the real life. Tolkien, of course, didn't mean to do that. Even Lewis didn't do that, right? Someone like Mr. Tumnus doesn't represent a specific thing in a Christian walk. And so when Tolkien says that he doesn't like writing allegory, that's exactly what he means.
Writing the same story in different words.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
So when you point to a theme that you see in his work and it's been influenced by the World Wars, or by the Bible, or by mythology, we're not saying that, we're not kind of going against Tolkien's theme of hating allegory, as people like to claim. That's certainly not the case. I just want to point out that misunderstanding before we get into this discussion of themes, because that's very important. Because one of the big themes in the story is temptation, and I think it's not something we see a lot of in our current, or at least we're seeing less of it in our current stuff. Maybe I'm wrong, but
I think that you're onto something, because I think that temptation today is sometimes mistaken for desire, and desire being a part of who you are is something that you should capture.
Yeah.
The obvious temptations of selfish versus caring for someone else, or being fair to someone else, those ones still exist today, but not in the deeper sense I find in movies.
And this theme is so very prevalent in all of his work. The most obvious example is the ring, but we're going to even get in a bit further than that. So we have like the Hobbit, where the temptation of the gold of the dwarves is what drove Smaug to the mountain. And even after Smaug is defeated, they still have the Arkenstone, which is driving Thorin mad. This temptation is driving him insane. And then that same temptation from the dwarves even we see in Moria, as they delve too deep into the mines, and so they are then stricken by this Balrog. It's this, you dive too deep into temptation, you're going to get punished for it.
Yeah.
And he has this constant theme showing up. And of course, the obvious example then is the ring. That's kind of the representation of all temptation, really. Temptation of power, and that is a very strong sort of theme. And one of the more interesting things, as we were discussing this earlier, is that it's sometimes temptation can take on a greater good aspect to it, where it's not even necessarily selfish, but it's like, I'm doing this for the greater good. So we look at someone like Boromir, who is a perfect representation of what temptation can look like for someone who wants to do good things. Because Boromir really just wanted to fight against evil. He just wanted to save his people. But he was still tempted to do one wrong thing in the pathway towards this greater good.
Yeah, because, what's a little evil to do a lot of good? Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually another thing. When we're talking about Gandalf and Galadriel, they had the opportunity to have the ring, or even just forcibly take the ring. Mm-hmm. But that small evil action would have driven them to evil desires and to evil actions, even if they genuinely wanted to do good with it. And if we're getting into it specifically, temptation, when it sometimes uses that desire to do good and twists it just a little bit, So I think that this really comes when someone is given the opportunity for a lot of power, and he replaces what is good, or he at least puts himself as the moderator between what is good and what is evil, and he says, well, if it's given to me, then I can use it this way, and by virtue of becoming more powerful, I have the potential to be more good. And I think that person, and I think we all do this, we confuse ourselves as a good thing as we get more powerful, and that's not the case. We just have more potential for good or evil. Mm-hmm. And it's exactly what Boromir does. He does genuinely want to save Gondor, and he wants to save really the whole world from Sauron's might, and he actually has the genuinely good desire. The problem is that he unconsciously replaces what is good with what is himself.
Right.
And the chances are, if you're going to do something truly good, it's usually not going to benefit yourself, because you're simply not the best thing.
Yeah.
The best thing is above you, and it always will be.
Yeah.
Which means that you will necessarily have to be selfless in order to be good.
Yeah. I mean, if we look at someone like Gandalf versus Boromir, right? Because Boromir had that, and he kind of recognized that he had the power to take the ring, and he decided to go for it. Whereas someone like Gandalf was literally killed himself in a sense to protect the ring bearer, right? Mm-hmm. He had more power than Boromir did, arguably, but at the same time, his role in it was so very selfless, right? He was willing to die even for the for the good of it, not necessarily. Anyway, again, it didn't benefit him. It was very selfless. I mean, I guess it did benefit him getting the power up later on, but that's a different discussion. Yeah. But he didn't know, even then, right? It was a very selfless act to do that, whereas someone like Boromir was doing it selfishly, as you kind of pointed out. Mm-hmm. And yeah, we can kind of talk about, I guess, the discussion of corruption kind of leads right into that. But one of the, because you were saying the corruption of the good, and I think the pinnacle of understanding what the corruption in the story is going to be Saruman.
Yes.
Right? He is the epitome of it, because to him it wasn't even necessarily. I mean, it was temptation, but I'd almost say it was also losing hope that drove him to corruption. Right? He almost believed that it wasn't possible to beat Sauron, so then we have to join him. Right? It wasn't even necessary he was tempted by the ring, because he didn't even know that the ring was found until Gandalf told him. And so for him, it was more losing hope. And obviously that corruption ran deep. So very deep that, like, because from what I understand I want to get kind of briefly augment this with saying that I haven't read all of the Silmarillion, and a lot of the background stuff. So a lot of the stuff I might know of vaguely. I'm not going to get into too much specifics, but I know that the wizards are practically angels sent down on Middle Earth to overwatch it. And so Saruman's role in this was a good one, but then he ended up becoming corrupt, to a point where his power had to basically get taken from him and given to Gandalf, someone else who could do that role, because his role was very was taken over. He lost sight of his role.
And you can almost see in his mind, it's once I have solidified my power, then I can start taking care of all this stuff. It's we have to do a little bit of bad to do a lot of good.
Right.
It's this replacing himself as the replacing himself unwarrantedly as the arbiter of good and evil.
Right.
And the selfishness of the action is quite hidden to oneself if you do that, because you think that you're an emissary of what's good. And then actually, if we're continuing to talk about Saruman, one thing that is good to note is that he was Saruman the White, and he starts off as this pure, powerful wizard, and he grows in increasing power, and he begins to use it for evil. He begins to use it in particular, I think, the most important and most powerful power that he uses. In particular, he uses it to lie, and it's an enchanting lie. And he finally dispenses with his white robes and gains these rainbow type robes that appear different to whatever perspective you're looking at it from, or whoever you are. It's purposefully vague.
Right.
And the reason is because it symbolizes what he's become. He lies to each person as an individual, and he kind of isolates everything and says, okay, between me and you, this is a possibility. And by the way, it's good to note that it's actually a real possibility. It could actually happen, with the elimination of all the other people that he's told different lies to as well. And so it's really tempting, because it's power, but power for potential good, and it's free power, and he doesn't have to do much. He just has to step aside or do this one little thing. It's so enticing. And the problem is, from Saruman's position, if you do that enough times with enough people, you can't hold all those promises. Not as if you were going to hold them by the end anyway, but these visions are totally incongruous with each other, because there's only one true overall vision that he's going to be having, and who cares who it's with. And with that, what's even more interesting is that his tactics don't change even up until the very end, when he becomes weak and pathetic after having his power broken by Gandalf. He just doesn't have the enchanting power of the magic lie anymore, and they're just regular lies now. And
so, for those of you who've only seen the movies and haven't seen the books end in a very different way. In particular for Saruman.
Oh
I'll kind of
yes.
just give a brief rundown, just in case you're just to watch, just the watcher of the movies and haven't read the books. Basically, instead of getting killed at Orthanc, as we see in the movies, they're left there, and eventually Saruman and Grima Wormtongue end up leaving Orthanc somewhere among the rest of the War of the Ring, and they make their way over to the Shire. And in so doing, corrupt the government of the Shire and take it over. It isn't until the four hobbits return and basically fight back against Saruman that we see the end of the story.
Mm-hmm. And with this, this brings on to the this is actually fantastic because it brings on to the point I was getting to, which is, with this significant loss of power, and now that his power is very much only physically manipulated.
Yeah.
He overestimates himself completely. His vision of who he is and what the world is are so incongruous that he makes ridiculous tactical errors, and he becomes probably the most pathetic being beside Wormtongue. Like they're very pathetic by the end of it.
Right.
And Saruman completely loses to a bunch of hobbits, and he still thinking that he has this kind of power over Wormtongue. Puts too much pressure on him to follow him and basically be his slave. And Wormtongue, who's just and truly desperately had enough of it, even after being given the offer by the hobbits to be free, because, by the way, he doesn't believe it because he's lived around lies his whole life, and maybe to a degree he still believes in the power of Saruman. Even after all that, he desperately kills Saruman and he runs off to his own death.
Right.
And it's really a lesson in how lies don't only cloud the vision of the person who is being lied to, but it clouds the vision of the perpetrator as well, of the person who tells lies as well,
right.
And certainly too many.
Right. One of the and I kind of want to jump ahead here because we touched on some other things, but the one I actually want to touch on here because it definitely relates to Saruman and Gandalf is companionship. And I don't know if this is an intentional theme in his work, so I'm only going to touch on it briefly. But I wonder if there's a potential theme in when we read about Saruman and Gandalf, and we read about the other wizards as well. We read about Radagast and the two Blues, which are very lightly mentioned. All of them kind of lose their path, with the exception of Gandalf. And of the other two that we do know of, so Radagast and Saruman, even like I said, Radagast doesn't seem to go evil. He's not evil, but he kind of loses his path, and he's kind of just doesn't really live up to the role that he's been given either. But I wonder if, again, might have been unintentional, might have been intentional. I wonder if part of that reasoning is because someone even as powerful as Gandalf or Saruman or Radagast needs to have companionship.
Mm-hmm.
Because as we go through the story, we run across all these individuals who have been touched by Gandalf or who have been known by Gandalf, right? The hobbits all deeply mourn him when he dies because he has often been a regular visit and beloved by the hobbits. At the same time, we come across Faramir, who was, a disciple of Gandalf, was a wizard's pupil, and there was this people in Gondor knew him as Mithrandir, a completely different name than people in the Shire would have known him. He is known by so very many different people all across Middle Earth. Sometimes even deeply. He has deep friendships with Aragorn and whatnot. And again, he knew so very many different people. And yet we look at someone like Saruman, who at one point walked with Treebeard in Fangorn Forest, but eventually kind of isolated himself.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Even if he had, let's say, Wormtongue at some points during his parts there, he never treated him as an equal, never spoke to him in any sort of compassionate way, but more of a subservient way. And then the same thing with Radagast. Didn't engage with people. He was more just a bit odd because he engaged with wildlife, and that was it. And so I wonder if there's this subtle theme of companionship is what keeps us on the right path.
Well, you're also touching on another thing, like Gandalf treats treats the people around him as in soul, not in power, but in soul equal.
Mm-hmm.
They're all intelligent life, and and they care as well, and their care for him equals his care for them, and it's there's this emotional reciprocation, and he knows where he is in the world as well, because he's constantly talking with different people, and enjoying their companionship, and he's staying true to his mission, which is to protect and keep an eye on this rather powerful world.
Right.
And Saruman, not only I think Treebeard touches on this really well, and he says that his mind has become a mind of machines and wheels, and has lost that compassion of life, because Saruman has kind of seen himself supersede life.
Right.
And so once you're over top of something, then you sometimes mistake being over top of something as understanding it in its entirety. But there's a lot of ways that things are greater than you, even though you might have power over it. And one of them would be that compassionate and loving companionship.
Yeah. And the next theme that we actually had on the list here is the underdog, but this kind of still talks about Gandalf and Saruman, insofar as they view the world. Right. Saruman believes that that to fight evil you need to have great power, whereas Gandalf kind of puts his trust in smaller things. Right. When the dwarves ask Gandalf to find someone to help them take over the mountain from a dragon, he doesn't come up with a mighty warrior. And he knows Aragorn, and he knows Beorn, he knows a number of people who probably could have qualified a bit better, but he picks Bilbo. And I think part of the reason he picks Bilbo is because Bilbo needs it, for one thing. But I think he also trusts in this greater power of guiding the small and weak, and trusting in that will end up winning the day.
Right? Yeah, actually, you're exactly right in that. The way that he works is not by... It's in those times of peril that he makes sure that these powerful people are all together fighting evil and doing their responsibility. But it's not an issue of responsibility when we're looking at the Hobbit. This is an issue of growth, and you don't just give that to an experienced guy who's already gone through all of that, because what's the point? You win the mission and maybe these dwarves grow. That's fine for them, but what about this guy? What's the point? You put someone there who hasn't had the opportunity, and you give him a chance to grow, and that's exactly what Gandalf does. And it comes from this from a compassionate place, ironically as well. I also think that Gandalf is properly depicted as a little bit insane as well.
Yeah.
Because the older and the wiser are also the more foolish as well.
Yeah, senile almost, right?
Yeah. The fool and the wise man are not opposites in any kind of mythology. Yeah,
but let's not be fooled to think that this is a deeply Christian message. The message that the underdog is very deeply Christian. Right, we look at Greek mythology, which is very pagan, and even Norse mythology. There's no underdog message there. It's all being the best.
And you've probably heard the story of Achilles in Troy, and Achilles is just the best. There's he does bad things, sure, but it's
he's physically the best, right?
Who cares? Because everything that he does, he weeps big, he laughs big, and he fights an army big. He does everything that he does is just to the extreme the best.
Yeah.
But what Alex is touching on right here is it's the meek, humble hero who has been unwillingly given a burden to overcome that that in a very Christ-like way succeeds and delivers the people.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny because I've heard it kind of demonstrated before in the Christian perspective, is that like Satan's greatest sin, his greatest thing that he did that was evil was pride, because he wanted God's power. And the way that God beat him wasn't with great power. It was literally by taking away that power from himself to beat him. It's kind of this ironic move on God's part where, he kind of showed Satan that power, while of course awesome and wonderful, wasn't even necessary for beating Satan. I kind of find this ironic. And so at the same time, you see that where that thought doesn't even cross Sauron's mind in Lord of the Rings, that someone like a hobbit, so humble and meek and small, would even be capable of something like that. And so that's why he has no defenses for it, right? You think that if you think that there was one place where you could destroy the ring, you'd have a battalion of guards standing at the gate there. But to him, the thought that they even tried to destroy the ring, first of all, didn't even cross his mind. And even if they did, there's no way he would have suspected a hobbit doing it. Because why would you send a hobbit into that kind of thing? Right? In Sauron's mind, he kind of has the same mind as Saruman, in that they're going to strike with great power. And that's why the little coup at the end, where Aragorn approaches the Black Gate with his army and with Gandalf, it distracts him, because it's to his mind, that is how he loses, is by great power. This great king and this great wizard show up at his gate, and it's this final conflict that's going to decide it. Meanwhile, we have these tiny little hobbits going into the back door and throwing the ring in the fire. Well, they don't, but that's a different... that's actually, I think, kind of touches on to our next point.
Well, that's the next point. It's evil, ironically, overthrows itself.
Well, okay, so the next point was mercy, but I'm also going to touch that with... because it's actually the same theme, kind of.
No, I think that you can put the two together, though. Because with... It's not ultimately the hobbits who are throwing it into Mount Doom, because Frodo, by the end of it, is just not capable of that anymore. Mm-hmm. He's been holding on to this evil for too long. No matter what moral efforts he's put in, this power is too much.
Yeah. And that's what I love about how Tolkien does this, because any other writer, I would think, wouldn't have been able to put in this message to the same degree. Because you finally get to the end, this very climactic thing, and you throw the ring in, la-di-da, you're done.
They would have been so tempted,
right,
just to make the hero exactly as it usually is done.
But instead, he shows, first of all, that it's evil that throws itself in, and it was actually the simple acts of mercy that led up to that point. So one of the very first times we hear about that, right, when Gollum is kind of being discussed between Frodo and Gandalf in the Shire, in Fellowship, Frodo kind of makes a snide comment about saying, it's a pity that Bilbo didn't kill him when he had the chance. And then Gandalf kind of points out, he says, wait a minute, it was actually pity that made sure that Bilbo didn't do that. Mm-hmm. Because the mercy of Bilbo, I think, is going to have a larger part to play in all this. Later on, we see the same mercy being showed by Frodo as he takes pity on Smeagol, especially when we see him in the pool. I forget what the name of the pool. It's like the sacred pool that any trespassers have to be killed by. And then Faramir has this trap set. And they're about to kill Gollum, and Frodo kind of says no. He has this perfect opportunity to end Gollum's life, and he takes pity on him and doesn't do it.
And by the way, even better, it wouldn't have been his fault.
Yeah.
It would have been Gollum's fault.
Yeah.
And
yeah, it would have been perfectly just, but he took mercy on to save his life. And it's that act of mercy that ultimately leads to the overcoming of evil. But at the same time, and it's kind of ironic, because it's not as though that act of mercy directly leads to the overcoming of evil, but it indirectly, through evil, is then what it is, kind of throws that evil off course in a weird way. Because it's still the draw of the ring that leads Gollum to wrestling with Frodo over the pit of Mount Doom, that throws the ring in.
Yeah. And Gollum is not, well, he's not happy with being seemingly betrayed by Frodo, which it kind of is that. Like, Frodo does lead him into the trap, but that is to save his life. And Alex and I were talking about this beforehand, and he pointed out that this is almost that there's almost a small lesson here. Not almost, there is a small lesson here, and it's that
it's misunderstood.
You can explain it better.
It's kind of like a misunderstanding of discipline, right? You look at the bad consequences of discipline without realizing what you've been saved from. Right? When I don't think it's necessarily a big theme in that moment, but I think it's a nice thing to kind of look at, right? Where you go through something that's tough, or maybe you go through, or maybe you're getting disciplined, let's say even just by your parents, that it's saving you from something worse, right? And you may not even see it, because Gollum didn't see it. He didn't see the arrows being pointed at him in the dark, but Frodo's act of mercy still led to pain. The men ended up beating Gollum. Which wasn't great, but it was better than being shot in the dark. But he didn't know that.
And ultimately, Gollum's survival, by maybe at least 3, but probably more instances of pity, because there's a few times that Sam, and rather justifiably so, I would say, Sam argues that Frodo should just kill Gollum right here, right now. But there's at least 3 instances where pity stays the hand of either Frodo or Bilbo to killing Gollum, and there was any one of these instances could have meant the death of Gollum, but because of this pity and this mercy and because Gollum survives through this in a twisted but kind of providential way.
Yeah,
it turns out that Gollum's survival is the one thing that overthrows overthrows the ring, that destroys the ring.
Yeah.
Because Frodo can't throw the ring on his own into Mount Doom.
In his own power, he's completely powerless to it.
And it took the the ring's exerting power over both Frodo and over Gollum, and the ring wants these two to fight because the ring, being the embodiment of evil, is naturally divisive. And so it takes this fight between 2 participants who don't want the ring to be destroyed. It takes this fight to for the ring to accidentally fall into the fire of Mount Doom, and the ring seals its own fate. It overthrows itself, and this is another very Christian theme.
Yeah.
That Satan defeats himself by influencing the events so that he can kill God.
Yeah. Putting Christ on the cross was the absolute nail in the coffin, as it were, for Satan. But for him, it was his moment of triumph, right? From his perspective.
Yeah.
But from hindsight, it was his moment of defeat. And so it's this kind of moment when Sauron thinks he's won because he's corrupted Frodo, but he thinks that there's this failsafe. But ironically, the failsafe kind of kicks in for both, and it kind of has this lie that kind of works. It's 2 lies that don't work together. But there was one more thing I wanted to talk about. Oh yeah, there's this ironic thing too. Another ironic thing I want to point out, because Bilbo and Frodo are not the only ones who end up letting Gollum live. There's one other person that does as well, but his motives were very different. Now Sauron.
That's true.
So outside the events of what we read about specifically in the book, we read about how Gollum was taken captive in Mordor and tortured for the information about the ring. But then later on it's talked about how he escaped, and Gandalf kind of muses to himself and says, escaped, or was he set loose? As if Sauron had instead the intention, not mercy, but of maybe using this corrupted creature for his own ends. And yet, so there's the same action of sparing his life, completely different motive, and yet it leads to the downfall of Sauron. I think that's actually, again, there's an ironic sense
Yeah. Yeah. But it implodes on himself because he used it for himself
Yeah,
once again.
exactly.
And if there was the that's right. So I actually really want to hammer this in because lies don't work together.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're used to thinking of truth. People just in general are used to thinking of truth versus the lie, as two different things. There's one truth, but there are many lies, and many lies also conflict with each other.
Right.
They're not they're constantly disagreeing with each other, and that's why Saruman, who tells all these different lies to everyone, they don't work together. None of these visions work together. Nobody's going to win except for maybe Saruman, but he doesn't, because the two lies at the end conflict, and it brings down the ring. The lie of power for Gollum and the lie of power for Frodo. Those two lies bring the ring down.
Yeah.
And it's self-destructive, and it takes away all the great connections and elements. And yeah, I think that's really the ultimate point of the story.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, another I think I want to touch on companionship too, because we don't get anywhere without the companionship motif.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's I think another huge theme in the book, and we definitely talked about a little bit of insight of like whether or not the wizards kind of fell away from their task because of lack of companionship. But I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the companionship that develops between a lot of individuals in the story, whether it be the actual fellowship, which is a very important thing, but then we have specific companions being drawn closer and closer together. The most obvious and prevalent example is Frodo and Sam, but we even see that showing up in Legolas and Gimli, who by all rights should hate each other. Their fathers were literally, one had thrown the other father in prison and hated each other for that specific reason, and yet these two were able to kind of become very close friends. Exactly. And even like we see Merry and Pippin as well, their companionship leading to a lot of events that quite frankly changed the course of the world. And I think that is another massive theme that Tolkien really drives home. It's not subtle at all, and I think it's very important. And again, another very Christian message. We read in the end of the book of Ecclesiastes where a cord of three strands is not easily broken, and that if a man should fall down alone, that he is in dire straits, but if should he fall down with a brother beside him, he's able to help him pick him back up. And the basic theme in Genesis that is not good that man is alone. We see this theme time and time again. I was even pointing out to Joel how every single time people think that Frodo was meant to do this task alone. He thought he was supposed to do this alone, right? Like he sits there and ponders, he's like, I know I need to do this alone. I need to leave everyone else, especially after the corruption of Boromir. I can't let that happen to anyone else. And Aragorn kind of agrees with him. He says, hey, yeah, you should probably do this on your own. Later on, Gandalf reflects to Aragorn. He says, oh, I've heard, I understand that Frodo had to do this alone. And yet, he didn't. He had Sam with him the whole time. Sam disagreed with Frodo very, very importantly on that. And then when Aragorn pointed out to Gandalf later on, he says, no, there's Sam went with him. And he says, oh, actually, that's better. Better than I thought. Right? Because we're so tempted, I think, often, to look at our lives as if we were an island.
Yeah.
Right? We think every task that we have to do is going to throw other people under the bus. It's going to hurt them. We have to carry our own burdens. We have to make sure that no one else gets caught up in the troubles of our lives.
And these aren't things that are necessarily false. A lot of these things are true, but there's a greater perspective, and we share each other's burdens, and through that we find comfort both for ourselves and for the other person, in helping each other out. There's a lot of joy in it, and undertaking suffering with someone.
Yeah.
And very purposefully and voluntarily. There's a lot of comfort in it, and because there's a heroic element in it, because you know it's good, and it gives you peace.
Mm-hmm. I'm perfectly convinced to sit here and say that Frodo would have turned into Gollum very quickly if Sam hadn't been there.
Yeah.
Right? How grounded does Sam keep Frodo? And we see that, right? Like you said, like being with each other when we suffer, right? We rejoice with those who rejoice and we weep with those who weep. And that is a very important thing to do with each other. And like I said, I think that is one of the main themes of the book. And I'd say, you say it's the distinction between the lies that don't line up and the truth, which is a good theme, and I think that's definitely there. My suggestion for the main theme would be companionship, but I think that's perhaps a different. Yeah, I mean, what do you guys think? Do you think that obviously there's so many themes to the book, but do you guys have one that's kind of your favorite theme, or one that you think is kind of the most relevant or most powerful theme of the book? If so, feel free to share with us. We're always open for that discussion. The thing with Tolkien is that we can literally go on for hours.
Yeah.
We've gone on for quite some time now already, so we're going to kind of wrap it up here.
Yeah.
I think next week we're looking into C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. Or sorry, not Tolkien. C.S. Lewis and Rowling, right? We were going to be doing.
Although I don't know if we should do that in separate episodes or not. You'll see whether we have that in separate episodes or if we have it together. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun, and I suspect that we will do more episodes on this in the future and get into the specifics of this.
Yeah, for sure.
It might be a long way off. There is so much to cover. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you later.
Yeah, see ya.